Good evening. Good evening. My name is Natalia Alexiun, the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies and the Interim Director of the Bud Shorenstein Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you all, both our audience here in person and those joining us online, to the inaugural lecture in a Bruce Greenberg series. Today we'll hear from the eminent historian, Professor Jessica Roitman of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. The series will continue later this semester with a lecture by Professor Aviva Ben-Or of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and in the fall with a lecture by Professor Laura Arnold Liebman of Princeton University. Thank you, Bruce, for your generous gift, for your passion for Jewish learning, and for your commitment to highlighting new scholarship in Jewish studies. This series underscores the importance and vibrancy of our field and celebrates the Shorenstein Center's role as one of the national and international centers for the study and teaching of Atlantic, Caribbean, and Latin American Jewish studies. With the recent hire of the Alexander Grass Chair in Jewish Studies, Professor Raanan Rein, whose work focuses on Jews in Spanish-speaking countries, and the launch of the Consortium for Jewish Studies across the Americas, the center is poised to play a critical role in promoting interdisciplinary research, teaching, and collaboration on Jewish experiences in the Atlantic world, the Caribbean, and the Americas. We're also delighted to announce that this area will be further strengthened by a new position, the Bruce Greenberg Chair in Atlantic, Caribbean, and Latin American Jewish Studies. And I would like to thank Bruce Greenberg for his generosity and his steadfast support for the Bud Shorenstein Center of Jewish Studies. And it is so wonderful that the two wonderful supporters of the center are sitting together. And now it is my honor to present Jessica Roitman, who is Professor of Jewish Studies in the Faculty of Religion and Theology at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. She is a social and cultural historian whose work spans the early modern period through the 19th century. She draws on rich archival records to focus on Caribbean, Atlantic, and colonial Jewish histories, with particular attention to the intersections of minority status, ethnicity, religion, the private sphere, and the commercial networks, and the list goes on. She is the author of The Same but Different, Intercultural Trade and the Sephardim, 1595-1640, and the highlights of the Mangui Maduro Museum and Library. She has edited and co-edited too many important volumes to list here. Let me just give you two titles: Dutch Atlantic Connections, 1680-1800, Linking Empires, Bridging Borders, and The Imperial Turn in Dutch Jewish History, Cases, Questions, and Considerations. In addition, she published more than 24 articles and book chapters in various important venues. Professor Roitman serves as co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Early American History, as the editor of Brill's Privacy Studies book series, and Amsterdam University Press's Jewish Urban Culture series, and as a member of the editorial board of Jewish Historical Studies. This evening, she will share with us in plain sight, Sex and Scandal in the 18th Century Curaçao Sephardic Jewish Community. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jessica Roitman.
Okay, I think I've followed directions. Good. I'm a historian, technology, don't know what to do. Thank you, Natalia, for the really warm welcome. Thank you to you all for being here. Special thanks to, I don't know if Sonia's here for all her, Sonia Stahl, for her help. Dee, for your help. Natalia, and especially to Bruce Greenberg for sponsoring the lecture series. It's really an honor to be here. When I was asked what I wanted to talk about, there's all sorts of interesting things that I'd like to talk about, but I thought, it's going to be after 6, people are tired, we got students coming, so let's try to keep it interesting. We'll throw some sex, some scandal, keep you all interested, but hopefully build out from that, from this micro history, to talk about larger issues of Jewish history in the Caribbean. I want to leave a lot of time for questions. I love getting questions from the audience. A lot of times I'm asked things and I don't know the answer to, which helps me learn more. Please don't ask me questions while I'm talking because I'll get very distracted, but I will leave lots of time for questions. So I'm really thrilled to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, Sephardic Jewish communities in the Caribbean. If I can move it ahead. Yeah, there we go. So I want to start off talking about this juicy scandal, of course, why you all are here, but then zoom out a bit and talk about the Dutch Atlantic world. And you know, this is always an issue for me when I'm giving lectures because I don't know how much people know. You know, I've spent my career actually in the Netherlands. I got my PhD from the University of Leiden. So in that context, people know a lot, but when I speak to more American audiences, people are like, oh, who are the Dutch? Where are they? So I'm going to zoom out a little bit and give some background on that, then focus in a bit more on Curaçao, the Curaçaoan Jewish community. Then I want to talk about this case more because it's juicy, it's scandalous, it's really interesting. Talk about the evidence, how we know what we know about this case, because that's also quite interesting. And how society worked, because that's what really fascinates me. That's this book project I'm trying to write about this case as a micro-history. How society was working in Curaçao at this time, not only for the Jewish community, but enslaved people, free people of color, Protestants, Catholics. I want to find out how that worked, so I want to delve into that a bit this evening. And also talk about how things worked legally and judicially as well. And then just end with what I think what kind of conclusions we can draw, what kind of questions are raised by this case. So yeah, 1775, there's a big scandal in Curaçao. Actually, if you know anything about Caribbean Jewish communities, which you don't have to, that's why you're here, but especially the community in Curaçao is known for being fractious. Now, those of you all who are part of a Jewish community, I know will be very surprised that communities can be fractious, right? No synagogue has ever had any conflict or been fractious. But the Curaçaoan community, especially in the 18th century, is particularly fractious, particularly prone to all sorts of conflict, internecine things going on. But this one was even greater than the other ones. I came across this case sideways, a bit by accident. I was looking for some other things at the Amsterdam City Archives. The Amsterdam City Archives houses the archives of what they call the Portuguese Jewish community, the Sephardic Jewish community from really the very earliest part of the 17th century. And I came across this folder with actually a lot of budget sheets to pay for some sort of legal case. So I was interested, but you know, I didn't have time to delve into it. And it was only a couple years later when Aviva Ben-Ur, who was mentioned by Natalia, who's going to give you all a lecture later as part of the series, she and I were looking at what we wanted to write together. We wanted to write a chapter together, and I thought about this case. And then I went and looked in the National Archives of the Netherlands, and I found a lot, which I'll tell you some of this evening. So yeah, it's a scandal, and now I'm going to tell you about it. I don't know how many people have read 19th century Russian novels. If you've read any good. Yeah, good. Some of you good. I'm only mentioning that because if you've read a 19th century Russian novel, you know that there's a list of characters. And they're what they call all their nicknames and everything. So if and when I ever get this book written, I feel like I'm going to need that because there's a long cast of characters and they actually all have multiple names that they're referred to. If anyone's familiar with Curaçao or Papiamento, and I'll tell more about that in a minute, a lot of people also have nicknames. So it becomes, very entangled. But for the purposes of this short lecture and keeping people focused, I'm going to focus on the main cast of characters. We've got Sarah Pardo from a long-standing family on the island. So she is the niece of her husband, the second guy, Selima Vazfaro. Now you might think, ooh, that's already scandalous and kind of upsetting and weird. Within Sephardic communities, uncle-niece marriages are actually not at all uncommon. Not at all uncommon. You come across it a lot. That leads to all sorts of problems much later in Sephardic communities with actually genetic diseases and all sorts of things, but it's not uncommon at the time. He is the brother of her mother. He's much older, and they do not have children. We know they've been married at least 10 years and they do not have children. Then we have her husband, also her uncle. He's elderly, he's in poor health. And we have Abraham da Costa Andrade, also from a long-standing Curaçaoan family. I'll tell more about the community in a minute. So he's also married. He's accused of adultery with Sarah. He also, no children with his legal wife. He is excommunicated. So I'll tell you all about that. But these are the main people you need to keep in mind. So I want to zoom in just to kind of keep you interested here for a minute. And by the way, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint with anyone who wants it. I can give it, you can send it to you directly or share it with Natalia or Dee, and they can share it. So yeah, accusation breaks out in 1775 because Sarah is pregnant. And you would think, okay, well, a pregnancy is a cause for joy. She hasn't been able to get pregnant in 10 years. Cool, that would be great. The issue is that no one believes that her husband is the father. They've been married for 10 years, no kids. In fact, his health has been so bad that they've twice been legally divorced with a get in Jewish law, like a divorce. The rabbis come by, and that is because the custom of levirate marriage was still being practiced. Not everyone may know of that. It's a Jewish custom that if that the brother needs to marry, or a brother needs to marry the childless widow of his brother to kind of keep the family line and his inheritance going. So to prevent that, twice they've had this sort of official divorce because they thought that he was on death's door. So no one believes that he was healthy enough to father a child. There are rumors of an attempted abortion, with people saying, okay, but if it's really her husband's child, why would she attempt to have an abortion? So yeah, rumors are spreading. And there's so many rumors that the Mahamad, so some of you may know, some of you may not know, within Sephardic communities, the Mahamad is the ruling sort of board of directors of a community. And at this time, they have a lot of power in Sephardic communities in the Caribbean, but also in Amsterdam. So they really have a lot of power, and they impose a harem, an excommunication on Abraham. So we think of excommunication a lot with Spinoza. If you've heard of Spinoza, big deal, he gets excommunicated. Also Uriel da Costa. Not all excommunication works like that. In fact, the vast majority of it doesn't. Those were really exceptional cases. In most cases, you're excommunicated for a couple days. It's a punishment, and that involves in this case, a man won't be called to read the Torah, which is part of the Jewish tradition, or you may have to sit in a different place, in a less prestigious place. There's various levels of it. Officially, people outside your family aren't supposed to talk to you or do business with you. So it's a social and religious sanction, but it doesn't always mean being thrown out of the community completely like we think of, or like in a lot of Christian communities, like excommunicated, that's it forever. But he is excommunicated. He's banned briefly from the synagogue. He has to pay a fine. I'll go a bit more into that. But Sarah is as well. It's also imposed on women. It's imposed differently, although she pays, they're different. She pays a different amount of money, but the social sanctions for her are greater than actually for her erstwhile lover. And this raises all sorts of questions. So upon what evidence are they making this case? You know, they're saying, hey, we heard a lot of stuff, and now we're excommunicating you, we're fining you, we're sanctioning you. So on what evidence are they making this decision? From whom are they getting this information? What are the boundaries of the public and the private? So this is their private thing, and also within the family that comes out. So what are the boundaries between the public and the community and the private, but also between Jewish law and what the community itself, the Mahamad, is deciding, and the colonial authorities? So, and there's actually other interesting things that come up, but these are the main ones I'm going to focus on. So I promised to give you these titillating bits, draw you in, get you interested, and I'm going to zoom out because I don't actually know how much you know about the context. Because you could be asking, I don't think anyone in this room is, but it's fine if you are, you could be asking, why are there Jews in the Caribbean in the 18th century? Where did they come from? Why are they there? Where's Curaçao? And that's okay. You don't have to know that. I mean, me and the, 20 people in the world that are super interested in this, we know this, but not everyone does. So that's okay. So I want to give you a little bit of a background to give you that context before I go into the rest of the story. So Dutch Atlantic world. The first Dutch West India Company is founded in 1621. And it's founded as part of, a few reasons. The Dutch had this long-running dispute with the Habsburg, with the Spanish Empire. They wanted to be free of it. This is part of the overall wars of religion. The Dutch Republic is Calvinist, Protestant. A lot of you may know this history already. But it's not just religious, of course. The Dutch are playing catch-up, a bit like the English and also the French. The Spanish and Portuguese had a big head start with European expansion, with these colonization efforts all over the world. The Dutch really want to catch up, so they founded the first Dutch West India Company in 1621. And they're not ever very successful. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, is much more successful and remembered much more fondly within Dutch historiography as well, because they captured a lot of the so-called Spice Islands, also what's now Indonesia. So, okay, but there was this Dutch West India Company, and they're also trying to start taking over trade routes. They do capture various territories from the Spanish and Portuguese, most notably Brazil, parts of Brazil, northeastern Brazil. That's where, and I'm not going a lot into Dutch Brazil right now, but if there's questions, we can talk about it. That's where the first synagogue in the Americas is founded, in Recife, in Dutch Brazil. I first learned about this when I was living in Brazil in my 20s. I had never heard about this. Typical Ashkenazi Jew from the US, so, history begins in the 1880s when lots of Ashkenazi Jews come to the Americas. Had never, ever heard of this story, became fascinated with it. So the Dutch hold on to this territory in Brazil for a while, lose it, but like the English and the French are really trying to, as I say, play catch up, take over these territories. New Netherlands, now known as New York, trade it to the English in part for Suriname, another Dutch colony. Seemed like a good trade at the time. So the Dutch are trying to take over, trying to get footholds throughout the Americas, competing. And yeah, Jewish merchants are integral to these Dutch Atlantic networks. So my last bullet point was Jewish merchants are integral to these Dutch Atlantic networks. And you may be saying, why? Why? Let me tell you. So the Dutch, also the English, but the Dutch desperately, desperately need people for these settlements. Desperately need them. Because, well, the Dutch Republic, the Netherlands is still a really small country, low population. And this, in the 17th century, is during the Dutch Golden Age, so-called Golden Age. You may have heard of it, Rembrandt, all these painters. It's hard to get people to leave the Netherlands. They don't want to leave. And they need people who will go. And, you know, why would people go? Things are going really well in the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic. You don't want to go, and you might die. And the very least is you're going to get sick. So it's very hard to get settlers. So, and in fact, actually, fun fact, about a third to a half of the sailors on Dutch East India ships, but also West India ships, are from German states or Scandinavians, because they just can't get Dutch people to go. So they think, all right, who might go to these godforsaken places and actually settle there? And they think, ooh, Sephardic Jews, cool. And why would Sephardic Jews go? Well, a few reasons. Or why would they want Sephardic Jews? Because they thought they might go, but also, and I'm not getting the whole history of conversos and new Christians in Iberia. I think a lot of people know that, but we can talk more about it. So they think, okay, well, these people speak Spanish and Portuguese. They have connections, often family connections with people on the Spanish and Portuguese mainland. But mostly they say, okay, I bet we can get these people to go because we can give them more freedom than they have in Europe. So they really actively start recruiting Portuguese Jews, Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam, also in Hamburg, also in Livorno. They even nail these sort of placards on the synagogue doors saying, hey, if you come to our settlements, look what we'll give you. And there's all sorts, and it depends a bit from chronology and between the English and the Dutch, but in general, more rights than they had in Europe. For instance, they can work on Sundays, on the Christian Sabbath. Also, their enslaved people can work on Sundays. They don't have to, for instance, if something comes to court or official, they don't have to do that on the Jewish Sabbath. In some places, again, it varies. For instance, in Suriname, they can serve on what's called the Raad van Politie, which is like the political council. In Curaçao, that's different. They can serve in the militia. So they have all these rights, also to own property, own enslaved people. So it becomes very appealing for Sephardic Jews to come and settle there. And they're gambling these people will stay, because they're already having issues with basically absentee landlords. So people who come, they want to make their fortune, they leave. So they gamble, and they gambled basically correctly. I mean, there's still a Sephardic Jewish community in Curaçao. It's small, but still about 200-300 people, most of whom are descendants of original families, some of these people I'm talking about. Suriname less, but there's still a community. So it was a good gamble. So I always put this up to let you know. Now, some of the North American ones come later. An Irish friend of mine was saying, why do you only have North Ireland? But yeah, these are showing, and some people don't know, you haven't heard of some of these places. it's okay, but these are where Jews are coming to settle in the 17th century to set up communities. And the main ones and the biggest communities are in these Dutch territories, in Curaçao and in Suriname. Suriname is mostly a plantation colony, and Aviva, when she comes to talk to you, has written a great book about it and can tell you more about it. And Curaçao is more of a commercial entrepot. So Curaçao came to the Dutch because no one else wanted it, basically. The Spanish dubbed Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire. I think Aruba is a very popular destination for Americans at beach holidays, that kind of thing. The Spanish dubbed them Islas Inútiles, so useless islands. They left them. So the Dutch took them over. And Curaçao was useless if you wanted to set up a plantation. It's very dry. You can't really grow very much there. So yeah, for agriculture, it's more or less useless. They were right. But there's a very deep water port in Willemstad, in the capital there, which became very good. And the location, circling there, right off the coast of what at the time the Spanish mainland, of what's now Venezuela, was really useful, particularly for the transshipment of enslaved people, legal and illegal, contraband and not. So it was very good to connect to the Spanish, Portuguese, but also the English networks. And so the value was really with the trade there, and certainly not with agriculture. So it became very useful for the Dutch, and it's still part of the Dutch kingdom. So they first, Sephardim are sort of lured there by around 1650 for an agricultural settlement. Doesn't succeed, but it does succeed very much commercially. So by the time we're talking about, by the 1770s, the Sephardic community numbers about 1,100 people on the island. Now you may think, wow, that's not many at all. That's very small. Considering the overall population of the island, it's a lot. It's about a third to a half of the white population. That's also, by the way, the case in Suriname, as Aviva will probably tell you about when she comes to talk to you all. And they're mostly Jews who are coming from Amsterdam, but also from other places. And by the way, the Amsterdam community also likes to send away their poor Sephardic Jews to the colonies, including particularly to Suriname, but also to Curaçao. So yeah, and there's these things that I told you about, this legal autonomy to govern their own community, to have this authority over Jewish life. And what's interesting, different also from Suriname or other places, there's no Jewish quarter. There's a synagogue, oldest still functioning synagogue in the Americas. Very close proximity to free people of color, but also enslaved people. Very crowded within sort of old city walls. So there's also a lot of overlapping domestic and commercial spheres. So basically it's sort of almost like a European old city, really crowded together with everyone together. Jews living right across from non-Jews, enslaved people, unenslaved. So one of the things that I thought was interesting about this case was this public-private, and I tried to kind of come up with this picture to depict how a house would look and how a lot of the old houses still look, which is basically that, you know, you would have a shop, or even like the Pardos, who I'm going to talk more about, who had their business, which is on the ground floor, and then domestic life would be on the first or even the second floors, and you know, domestic servants, enslaved people are living very closely with the family itself. So I gave you a brief overview of the scandal, but you might be saying, well, how do we even know about this scandal? I told you about, I came across all these records for how much the court case ultimately cost. But we know about it because there were these letters between the ill-fated lovers. They wrote each other a lot. Here's one, excerpt. I've translated it roughly from the Dutch. Yeah. They wrote a lot of passionate lines like this one. This was a particularly good one, but also very detailed attempts. It kind of reminds me of people writing stuff on social media and taking screenshots or something. It wasn't necessarily a good idea for them to put all this on paper, but they did. So they wrote very openly about her attempts to have an abortion. They wrote about where they would meet, their frustration with their spouses, with their parents. And they had enslaved people, but also free people of color transmit the letters back and forth to each other. Sarah's father, Isaac, caught one of the enslaved girls carrying the letter, one of the letters. He saw it, he read it. Eventually, we still don't know how they got the whole trove of letters. And soon the rest were discovered, and the scandal broke really, really publicly. And it could have remained probably a private and a more or less forgotten incident or forgotten to us in history. I mean, it blew up in the Sephardic community. The Muhammad then decided it had to take action because so many people were talking about it. But it could have just remained there, except that Abraham decided he wanted to challenge the Muhammad, challenge this excommunication, say, no, it's not valid. And he took his case to the colonial governor. And the colonial governor ruled in his favor. And the Muhammad did not like that. They said, hey, legally we have autonomy in these sorts of cases. We have the power, the jurisdiction over this. So, hey, we can decide on this. He's excommunicated. So that's when the case starts to blow up and they start calling witnesses. And that's when the letters start getting basically entered into more or less a sort of court, and the witnesses start getting called and giving their testimony. And that's how we know in more detail what happened. And some of the interesting features of the case, I think, are also linguistic. We know that the letters themselves, let me go back. This is from the National Archives, it's in Dutch. But we know it's a translation of the original letters in Papiamentu, which is a Creole language from Curaçao. In fact, I don't know if you can see up there very well, in Dutch it says in de Creole spraak, so in the Creole speech, to show that it's been translated, that it was given, this letter was written in Papiamentu. So two Sephardic Jewish lovers are writing to each other in the Creole language of Papiamentu. And they're not the only ones. A lot of the later witnesses in this case, not just actually, and this is also quite interesting, enslaved people who are being called to say what they knew about the case, free people of color, Protestants, a lot of them are giving their testimony in Papiamentu. And this really validates what Linda Rupert, a scholar of Curaçao, has said about the importance of Papiamentu, this Creole language, as a kind of a bridging different cultures, different classes, that basically everyone on the island is speaking Papiamentu. But for the Dutch legal records, it all needed to be translated into Dutch. And all sorts of people were called to testify. Abraham Andrade's brother testifies that he heard about the affair from, quote, two black women gossiping in the alleyway. So I tried to come up with a picture. The alleys are quite narrow. Mrs. Clements, who's a Protestant widow, I think she's quite a busybody, but she testifies that she saw Sarah making a lewd gesture with a banana from her balcony. And she's testifying that. So yeah. And why I put that there is that one of the witnesses, when asked, but how do you know about this, said, there are no secrets here. No one can keep a secret in 18th century Willemstad. And there's other things, I think, that it was really these enslaved and free people of African descent who are playing a pretty significant role in information transmission, not just transmitting the letters, but also talking, and they're being listened to, and people, you know, believe what they're saying. And they're working in the households, they're moving between these domestic spaces, these private spaces, and these public spaces. They are also, and we see this in Suriname as well, in the synagogues. We're not quite sure what role during services, but they are there. And these observations are making or breaking reputations. So then I want to briefly, I think my time's sort of running out, and I want to make sure there's enough time for questions, talk about what this means jurisdictionally. And you know, it gets very complicated. I'm still trying to sort out all the back and forth. Basically, it's about who has authority. The Muhammad is saying, hey, when you granted us you lured us here 100 years ago, when you granted us the right, you said that we could decide on what happened within our community. The colonial governor is saying, well, yes, but this has escalated more. And what we see, and this is not an exceptional case, it's exceptional in the scandal, it's exceptional with how long it went on. But you know, Aviva's found it in Suriname for sure. Basically, and those of you who are familiar with a wonderful scholar, legal historian, Laura Benton, know about this, you know, how people use different imperial, different colonial, different legal systems to their advantage, sometimes turning to the Spanish or the French or the Dutch, and the Jewish community is doing the same. The Muhammad wants to assert authority, but you know, the people in the Jewish community are like, I don't like your decision, so I'm going to appeal to the governor because I might get the decision that I like better. And that's exactly what he's doing here, but it just keeps escalating. And yeah, it reveals those tensions between that autonomy within the Jewish community, but also the power of the colonial government. And it becomes, I've summarized it here, a 20-year-long legal battle, which is, as I said, how I first discovered it. It actually never gets completely resolved. It ends up costing everyone a lot of money. Resonances with today when you get into these legal battles, really protracted legal battle that ends up going to the highest court in the Dutch Republic at the time. And now I want to zoom out for a last minute. I'm happy to go into far more detail about the case or just other stuff, because it is a very rich case. And I alluded to this already, but one of the things I think is also interesting for an audience like this, is to help us rethink what I often see, and again, I already alluded to it, this North American-centric view of Jewish history. That Jewish history begins with people like my grandparent in the Americas, you know, who came over from Eastern Europe, and there were maybe a few exotic Jews at Shearith Israel in New York, and aren't they kind of cool? But that's sort of Jewish history, right? Or that's how I learned it. So I think looking at Curaçao, but looking at Jews in the Caribbean, can make us help us rethink that. So I always put these stats here for the population. Roughly, you know, finding it roughly around the same chronology. How many Jews are where? And we see that, you know, there's far more in Suriname, in Curaçao, in Jamaica, than in North America. There's, population-wise, the center of Jews in the America, but in the late 18th century is in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is really the center, not only population-wise, but we see that the Portuguese or the Sephardic model for Hebrew pronunciation, there's very few Ashkenazi Jews in Curaçao, or almost none. In Suriname, there are already quite a few. They eventually do form their own congregation, what they call the Hoogduits, the High German congregation. But initially, the Ashkenazi basically had to join the Sephardic congregations, adopted some of their rights. We have lots of cases of conflicts about kosher verification. The meat is verified as being kosher in the Caribbean, in Curaçao usually. The rabbis are being exchanged between these Caribbean settlements. So the Caribbean is the center, not just population-wise, but of actually religiously. They begin to assert their independence also from Amsterdam, from Europe. asserting their own independence religiously with rites and rituals. You get some fun controversies about that as well. And then I wanted to zoom in one last time, because what happened to our ill-fated lovers? So they leave after this long, protracted fight. They never, as far as we know, get together. Abraham leaves for Jamaica. Sarah leaves for St. Thomas. Sarah's father, Isaac Pardo, in fact, I don't know if Tom Thielen, who's a brilliant researcher, is watching this via live stream. He just sent me something earlier today that he found the last will and testament of Isaac Pardo, Sarah's father, in Amsterdam. So apparently he goes to Amsterdam in 1880, bringing 3 enslaved people with him, even though that's not allowed in Amsterdam, in the Dutch Republic at the time, possibly for health reasons, possibly because of this scandal. And this is tying into what we know, what the work of Josette Capriles Goldish has also shown about basically the scattering of Caribbean, particularly Curaçaoan Jews by the beginning of the 19th century. Curaçao's in economic decline, and a lot of Jews go elsewhere. As we say with our ill-fated lovers, many Jews go to the South American mainland, to Venezuela, to Colombia, to Panama, to the United States. I mean, there's still Jews, like I said, in Curaçao, but the community is very much in decline, and there's what Josette, but other people call this Hispanization of the Jewish community, some of whom give up their Jewish identity. It's a really interesting what happens. Again, there's still small Jewish community, but the majority of Jews dispersed throughout the Caribbean basin to Latin America, to the US. So that's brought this part of my talk to a close. I welcome questions. I don't know how much more time we have for questions, but happy to have questions, talk afterwards. 15 minutes.
I work on these Ashkenazi Jews, so I'm asking, really just mesmerized by the story, the personal story. Do we know what happened to the child? Was the child born, and what was the status of the child since this was common knowledge?
Because I didn't want to get too. I was worried like how much detail to get into. A boy, is born, and one of the controversies. In fact, one of the most affecting letters was Sarah writing Abraham saying about the attempted abortion and saying, he's really strong, my love, he's really strong, talking about the fetus. He's born a son. The husband, Vasfaro, does claim him. He even makes a statement saying, the child is mine. I found the strength to have relations with my wife. Other witnesses in the case say that he was coerced by his sister to make this statement. Anyway, he claims the child as his own, but the Mahamad does not allow the bris, the Brit Milah, like the circumcision, to happen because they're not viewing, or they say yes, but then he has to be claimed as a mamzer, as a bastard, which is a big deal in Jewish law at the time. So they hold off on the bris until the boy is 4, until some of this gets settled. Possibly some of that was also about inheritance. There could have been an economic aspect to claiming the child or not. But the child, as far as we know, I'm trying to trace what happened with him in St. Thomas. I was talking to Fernando about Gunvor Simonson's research on St. Thomas, and she's also been helping me to try to look for some of the records. If I can find, Sarah went to St. Thomas, what happened to this boy? But at least legally, he remained known as the legal son of Vasfaro. But kind of a sad story, really.
you so much for this. This was really, really fascinating. I'm going to ask you a question as a historian of the Caribbean and not necessarily of the Jewish diaspora in the Caribbean. But I was really intrigued by your point there that, you know, population-wise, the Caribbean is the center of Jewish history in the Americas. I find it very compelling, and I think you made the case just with this brief presentation. What I would like to hear you, if we could, for a few minutes or, if, you know, very briefly, what does that do to Caribbean history more broadly, right? If we take that point, right? Because Jewish history in the Caribbean, as far as I have, you know, gathered it as a really historian who is Brazilian in origin but is studying the Caribbean, it's so often seen as sort of an aside, something of a curiosity, right? What does it do? What is this doing to the broader historiography of the Caribbean?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that, because it's so true. And also when I started delving into this, it was this sort of exotic sideline, like exotic Jews. There's Jews in India, there's Jews in Kazakhstan, and there's a Jew in Jamaica. Like, it's this sort of exotic, weird thing that doesn't really mean much. And that's honestly also how I think Jewish historians have approached it. Like, let's only look at the community. And that's also a bit with archival sources as well. So I don't think we've done ourselves a lot of favors in how we've approached it as just, let me look at Jews on Curaçao or something. I've tried to, I think most of us are trying to move beyond that. There's a great, and I don't know if you've heard of her, Sarah Castile. She's works much more in literature, literary theory, but she's done some really interesting work looking at Sephardic influences on Caribbean literature as a whole, and not just Sephardic Jews that write literature, but the sort of resonances of the Sephardic presence that come through in Caribbean literature, which is really interesting. I think when we incorporate, and I think what Sarah's work is showing is that's actually almost impossible to separate the Jewish presence from Caribbean Jewish history, or the Jewish presence from Caribbean history, but we have to look at how deeply interwoven it is, which is getting back to where I think we haven't done ourselves a service. I mean, if you look at what Aviva and other historians of Suriname have been looking at, I mean, the Jewish community is a Jewish community of color in the end, and still is, and that's a whole different issue with halakha and other things. And again, this is an example from Suriname. There's a quite famous Surinamese author, Cynthia McLeod, and she writes about sort of historical fiction about Suriname. And in an interview, she said, "Yeah, but you know, you shake a family tree in Suriname and a Jew falls out, because there's so much of a Jewish presence intermixing, less so in Curaçao." So I think you can look at, of course, all the things we usually look at with, you know, commerce and economics or whatever, but I think it goes far deeper in terms of family, just family connections, family lineage, the arts, the literature. And one thing that, again, Sarah argues for, and I really agree with her, is that when we have this North American focus, and very unfortunately that Black Jewish relations can be considered, you know, sometimes quite tense. When you look at the Caribbean, it's very much a different thing in many ways, and that's not also to dismiss all sorts of power differentials and enslavement, but there's not that same sort of separation, and that gets more into, I think, the Caribbean history of hybridity, and Jews are very much intimately part of that. I think we just haven't looked enough at it, or again, people who are doing Jewish history are keeping it separated in a way, and that's one reason I've gotten more into also these stories about the enslaved people, the free people of colors, being so intimately involved in the lives of everyone's life. Again, still with the power differential, but that people aren't living very separate lives in any way.
Can you hear me? Yes, you can
Yeah.
hear me. Okay. So I'm sort of struck by your presentation, and it's going to be very weird what I'm saying, but I have to say it. That you seem to be taken aback by the scandal, as if it's something so unusual that there aren't scandals so much part of human culture. But I want to take it one step further and just say that when we look at the Caribbean, isn't that sort of what sets it apart in the sense that it's a transgressive space, much more so perhaps than other parts of the Jewish experience?
Not taken aback at all by the scandal. It's a fun one to work on because, as I said...
Sorry, can you talk up a little bit? It's hard for me to hear you.
I'm not taken aback at all by the scandal. I'm using it as a fun way to get into all these other issues. So there's all sorts of scandals all the time. We know about this one because so much happened with it because it was challenged. I mean, as historians, what we run into a lot is almost skewing in favor of scandal, in favor of criminality, because that's what shows up in the archives. When things are just kind of going along nicely, we tend not to see them as much. When we see transgressive behavior, such as something that goes to court, someone's arrested, that's the kind of stuff that shows up in the archives. But no, I mean, it's not that unusual. What's unusual about this one, as I said, is that it goes on so long, and the number of witnesses who are brought in from all swaths, from across this broad section of society in Curaçao. So that is not something that at least I've seen so much of in other court cases, but for sure there's lots of, there's fraud, there's all sorts of things coming up. In terms of the Caribbean as a transgressive space, I mean, that's certainly how people like to think about it. That's certainly the image of it. I don't know if it's any more or less transgressive than any other colonial space. In what way do you think it's more transgressive than another colonial space?
It's more sexually transgressive. And sorry, the idea of the interracial mixing is much more characteristic of that area, I think, than elsewhere, as far as I know.
Because of plantation slavery, for sure. I think it's, if you're defining transgressive purely in terms of interracial sexual relations, sure. But this scandal isn't about that. And in fact, that's not really that big a deal. And again, I think Aviva may go into that much more in Suriname. The scandal here is amongst two Sephardic lovers. So that's, I think, a different thing than, Sephardic Jewish men are having sexual relations with enslaved African-descended women. But I feel like that's not quite what you're asking.
I'll just add one more thing to it. I don't want to take up too much time. But the element of who's conveying the letters is just so fascinating. And that's where I think there's a component to this is quite striking and quite unusual.
I mean, enslaved and free people doing stuff for people who employ them or enslave them is not at all unusual. The trust that they put in them to convey these letters is perhaps more unusual. And I didn't get into all this in my talk now, but you do see, and this is also what I think is a little more unusual, that certainly the free people of color are being called as witnesses to give their testimony in the case. That, I was asked by Abraham to convey this letter, he paid me this amount of money. And also, and again, this is probably not that unusual if you look at any society that has a strong component of enslavement. is this intimate knowledge of what's going on. And even when there's not enslavement, you know, the nanny maybe knows far more about what's going on in the house than you might want her to. So they're very aware of what's going on in the household. And playing, you know, some quite intimate roles. We hear one witness say that actually Isaac, the dad, wants to kick Sarah out of the house. And the enslaved people beg him not to because that will make it a bigger scandal. So there obviously is some, you know, level of trust, of intimacy, of, if not power, influence, because they're arguing with him not to do it. So I don't think that necessarily is even that unusual. What I think is interesting is that we're getting a glimpse of it.
Yeah, I actually, almost sort of related to some of what you talked about. I wanted to ask you about your research process and where you were able to draw a lot of these sources from. How were you able to jump from one to another? What were the most important sources of sources, if you will, for you?
So as I was saying, you know, I think, and if you've worked in archives, we get skewed a bit to scandal, to criminality, because it shows up, and it tends to be fun. Or else, I mean, at least in Dutch historiography forever, it had a very economic focus, because there were so many ledger books and budgets and stuff left, because that's what people, you know, were influenced by what people choose to save. I mean, what they find worthwhile in preserving in archives, and that influences what we can find. And you know, that's why we try to read between the lines, go against the grain, everything. As I said, I was looking for something else and came across this and put it aside honestly because it was a lot of budgetary stuff. And I just found that really boring, and I didn't want to go through all that. But I was thinking, well, why is the Portuguese community in Amsterdam paying a lot of money for this case? Like, what's going on? So I sort of made a note and put it aside until later, for all these other reasons. I thought, well, let me try to see what I can find about this. Now, this was I put on that slide digitization. So I had to go for the inventories and look it up. Now it's a lot easier. I have to give the Dutch, whoever does it, compliments for doing a massive digitization campaign. So there it is. Now all this has been scanned. It's still not necessarily, they're working on making it readable. If you just type in whatever, Sarah Pardo, that it would recognize the writing. That's not working very well yet. We hope to get to it. But I think the Dutch National Archives have been at the forefront of the digitization process, but they were always really well inventoried. And the archives of the Portuguese community in Amsterdam were also always well inventoried. So that made my job, I have to say, much, much easier in terms of finding this. But no, I mean, it's kind of the treasure hunt, and that's what I love about it. Like, so who are these people, and can I find them in these documents? And I'm sure there's a lot more, like as I mentioned, this man, Tom Thielen, who does lots of research in the archives, had found Isaac Pardo's in a whole will and testament in a whole nother part of the Amsterdam archive. So digitization and searchability will help a lot, but there's still, I mean, I think the Amsterdam notarial archives alone have something like 5 kilometers or more of, yeah, I mean, the Dutch are great record keepers. Max Deerdorf and I were talking about at lunch today about digitization of some of the British colonial records. A huge boon to us as researchers. I mean, the only thing I worry about, and this is more with my grad students, and I can sound like an old fogey here, is that if you count on everything being digitized, or whatever search you do, you're gonna miss so much. So I do worry with some of my students that if it isn't sort of easily coming up in whatever search, they're not going to actually look through the documents, because I think there's still so much to be found. But was that answering your question a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's awesome.
Yeah, but if you're interested in the Dutch archives, let me know, because, yeah.
I've been-
first, but I am.
Yeah.
I've been told I have the last question. So it's really more of a comment than a question. I think this, and I think that slide that you have up there is important. This was a phenomenal love story.
Yeah.
And it seems, you know, you didn't concentrate on that, but I think Shakespeare would have done a wonderful job, or somebody would have. This is a great love story, and you don't expect that to come when you talk about the Sephardic community of that period. And these two must have been really in love, or very, very horny, or something, because
Both,
they
you know.
obviously were risking such social isolation by doing this. They had to know it was going to be talked about. So I just found that a fascinating part of this story.
Yeah, I find it
And
really
thank
sad.
you
That's
for
why I
bringing it.
chose this one, because I found it, as I said, one of the most affecting ones. They obviously really cared about each other. I didn't go into it as much now because it would take too much time. One of the things I also found really interesting is that I think when we think about privacy and carrying on an illicit love affair, we think inside in a cupboard or something. But because of, you know, having servants, enslaved, and free people of color, everyone living cheek on jowl, most of their assignations were outside the city walls. There was actually more privacy outside, and they could get away, and you see that with their letters, with more in public, also at the synagogue. Like, it wasn't apparently considered that weird that Abraham might walk Sarah in, because, you know, the community's very close, lots of people are intermarried, whatever. They could get away with more in public. Also walking to the market together. Of course, people start to comment as well, like, oh, we saw him a lot, blah, blah, blah. But I found it fascinating that they could carry things on more in the public eye than at home. But yeah, it's really sad, and that's why I would love to find out what happened to the little boy. What happened with Sarah? Did she remarry? I don't know. I really want to be able to trace that. But yeah, as far as we know, they were never together. As I said, we know that he moves to Jamaica and she moves to St. Thomas. And it does raise interesting questions. I mean, she's married to her uncle. We know marriages are largely arranged. And that's the case anyway in the 18th century. So yeah, I found it quite sad as well.
I wanted to add a question that came via streaming.
Oh, okay.
From love to statistics. What is the size of the Jewish community in Curaçao
Now, between 200 and 300 people. They're doing great stuff. They just opened a museum, which unfortunately I haven't been to yet. And I was talking, I don't know if she's here, I was talking today. The Mongi Maduro Library has just gotten a grant from the British Library Endangered Archives program to digitize and make more widely available their collections. They have a fantastic collection of the Jewish community, but also lots of stuff that is really useful for people just doing Caribbean history. It's actually Fernanda's question about, even stuff that's focusing on the Jewish community can have a lot of relevance for the wider Caribbean history. My main contact has been Ron Gomez Caceres, one of the older families there. He's also done really interesting research, a bit like Bruce, on the Askamot, the bylaws of the congregation there, and also written some stuff on the cemetery. So there still is a really vital community, but it's small. I think a lot of the community also spends part of their time in the U.S., back and forth. There's also an Ashkenazi community that started coming in the 1920s as refugees from the war. I think there's Chabad there. The old Sephardic synagogue is now actually American Reformed Reconstructionist, I believe. So it's not where they don't do much with the old Sephardic rites, but they still have services on Shabbat. Beautiful synagogue. They have the sand floors, like a lot of the Caribbean synagogues. So they are still there, and they're really active in preserving their history and their culture.
Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, but join me in thanking Professor Roitman for this.
Thank you all for coming.
Wonderful, intimate story with bigger implications for the field.
Yeah.
And I also want to thank Dr. Rebecca Jefferson, our curator of the Issa Ray Prize Judaica Library, for bringing some of the treasures, and there's a lot more where it came from. Please come and visit. And there will be a little bit of time to mingle with Professor Roitman as
But I'm taking this off because it makes me...
As we are coming to an end with this wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.